academic at the University of South Australia in the Asia Pacific Centre for Work Health and Safety. So we do research all around how to improve worker health and wellbeing and safety at work. And I've been working on this issue of workplace bullying for 9 or 10 years now. I do my research in that area and also do some practice in that area. For example, working at the moment with correctional services in New South Wales to reduce bullying between staff there. So today I'm going to be talking about how to prevent bullying at work, and that's really what I'm interested in, the organisational duty of care towards their workers to create a safe working environment and how to change the organisational systems and structures to prevent bullying at work. I'd just like to acknowledge all of my collaborators. So this work over all of that time has been done with a lot of people, and it's really a big team effort, even though I'm the one here that's with you today. How's that for volume so far? Can you hear me okay in the back? All right, very good. So bullying is really a repeated pattern of unreasonable behaviour. So according to our Fair Work Commission legislation and our national guidelines on preventing and responding to bullying, it's when a person or a group of people repeatedly behaves unreasonably towards a worker or a group of workers at work, and the behaviour creates a risk to health and safety, so there's a harm element involved. And importantly, it doesn't include reasonable management action taken in a reasonable manner. And that's often where some of the grey areas are around understanding bullying at work. That's certainly come out in my research with cases of bullying. It's also come out repeatedly in the Fair Work Commission Stop Bullying orders. So I'm going to be touching a lot on that issue today. So a single incident isn't bullying, but by the same token, we shouldn't ignore any instances of conflict or aggression in the workplace, because conflict or aggression can spill over, there can be a counter-attack, and that can go on and turn into this pattern of repeated unreasonable behaviour. Or if one employee is aggressive to another and nothing happens to combat that, to stop that, that sends an enabling signal. That sends a signal to that worker, go on and keep bullying, and again this can turn into this ongoing pattern of behaviour that's known as bullying. So we need to take any aggression and conflict seriously, and we need to resolve it early if we're going to have a good outcome. In Australia, our bullying rates are actually quite high compared to those reported by workers in Europe. You can see up the top here that in last year and this year, information collected from all states and territories in Australia puts bullying exposure around 9.7% of employees in the last 6 months before responding to the survey. This puts us actually at the very top of the list compared with 34 European countries for exposure to bullying. So we should really take it seriously here in Australia. The last estimate that we collected in this national survey was in 2009 and 2011, and the rate was 7%. So actually bullying rates are actually increasing at the moment. And that's consistent with the data collected by SafeWork Australia, which shows that even though claims based on mental injuries are decreasing, those that relate to bullying specifically continue to increase. Bullying is also really costly for organisations and for the whole society. So in an independent report in 2010, the Productivity Commission estimated that it costs between $6 to $36 billion to our society and economy every year in Australia. So that's an enormous cost. Of course, the costs to the workers themselves are really high. In the ultimate case, and the most unfortunate case, like in Brodie Canlock's case, the cost can be suicide, death through suicide. So Brodie Canlock was a waitress who worked in a Melbourne cafe, and she was bullied relentlessly for months by 4 of her co-workers. The supervisor knew about this bullying and didn't do anything to stop it, and eventually she took her own life. So that's the most extreme potential result of workplace bullying, but bullying has been linked consistently over many studies with many thousands of people to mental health problems such as depression and anxiety, to sleep problems, to emotional exhaustion from work, to likelihood of leaving the workplace, and a whole range of other indicators. Very robust and reliable research on the negative effects of bullying. So I want to talk today about what the causes of bullying are and how we might go about tackling them from an organisational perspective. And just to clear you up to things I really want you to take away from this session, I've started with the key messages and then I'll unpack those and give you the evidence that relates to each of those as we go. So the first point that I really want you to take on board is that bullying is not a problem, or not primarily a problem of interpersonal relationships. So although it plays out between people in terms of interpersonal interactions, the causes of that can be seen in the larger organisational system, not just a product of those two people who are involved, two or more people involved. So bullying is actually a symptom of poor organisational functioning, okay? And what we've done is identify functioning in specific risk areas in the organisation that are known as the risk contexts. And the organisational climate also plays an important role in whether bullying occurs and in what can actually be done about it when it is occurring. So these are the three things I'd really like you to take on board. So bullying, not primarily a problem of interpersonal relationships. In 2006, a meta-analysis that looked over all of the existing research was published. So at that stage, there were 90 different studies, and it found that organisational factors are more consistent and more important predictors of bullying than are individual factors such as self-esteem of the target. And the two main factors that emerged were job demands. Okay, these are things that require effort in our work. Job demands increase the likelihood of people reporting exposure to bullying. So when the roles are unclear, when there's not a good boundary and scope for positions, when there's role conflict, so there's different expectations from different parties, and when there's role overload, so work pressure, too much to do, these are the conditions that are associated with bullying at work. Likewise, when there are a lot of work constraints, so barriers, bureaucracy, blockages to getting the work done, this creates the fertile soil for bullying as well. On the flip side, job resources, and in particular autonomy, so that's how much control someone has over when and how and where they do their work, that has a protective effect against people experiencing bullying at work. So on to the second point, bullying, while it's not a problem of interpersonal relationships primarily, it really reflects the functioning of the organisational system. And to illustrate this point, I draw on our recent study funded by SafeWork SA through the Commission Research Grant Program, where we looked at 342 of the bullying complaints lodged with SafeWork SA from 2010 to 2013. So what happened was all of those cases were transcribed, they were de-identified to remove all of any information about the companies or people involved, and then they were sent out to us for analysis. So we looked at the complaint form, we looked at all of the accompanying evidence. In some cases this was probably up to 180 or 200 pages just for a single case. The reports made by SafeWork SA inspectors, the outcome letter, and any other material in the case. So this was over 5,000, close to 5,500 pages of information that was being analysed in a systematic way, trying to look at what the underlying organisational factors were that could explain the majority of these cases. What we found is that it's the interface between supervisors and their subordinate workers that creates the fertile soil for bullying at work. So the way that supervisors go about their supervision, both what they do and the way in which they do it, during interactions in key functional areas actually shapes workers' experience of the job and their perception of bullying. So when supervisors are interacting with workers in terms of performance management, in terms of clarifying tasks and roles, and in terms of other few areas which I'll cover in a minute, that really creates that fertile soil for bullying. That's where workers feel like they're being mistreated, and therefore they take those steps to lodge a bullying complaint. So that really goes back to that issue of reasonable management action taken in a reasonable manner. So what are these functional risk contexts for bullying? Well, they reflect two different aspects of supervision. One is the potential misuse of hierarchical or formal supervisory power, and the other is insufficient supervision when there's not enough guidance provided. So in terms of the misuse of hierarchical power, the first area that was common to cases, and I should say that overall this framework was represented in about 90% of those 342 cases that we looked at. So far and away it's explaining most of those cases in our sample. Was when workers felt bullied when they're given illegitimate tasks. For example, a well-qualified primary school teacher might be asked to clean the toilets while they're trying to look after, 12 or so students. So this was seen as part of a pattern of unreasonable behaviour, which they labelled bullying. Another key area was pay, rostering and other entitlements. So there might be formal policies in an organisation around access to these things, but whether or not an employee can really have access to those might be determined by the supervisor, and that was seen in a number of cases as a way of bullying the worker by withholding access to those entitlements, or not being able to have input into rostering, or getting the most unfair rostering situation and so on. Favouritism was cited in a number of cases, and in 35% of cases the management of underperformance was raised either by the worker or somewhere else in the case notes. So tackling this issue of underperformance is a real key risk area for bullying perceptions and actual bullying. That's the other point I'd like to make about this analysis, is not all of these cases, and in fact most of these cases, didn't progress all the way through to determining that bullying was taking place. But these represent the risk areas for the complaints that are made, for the way that workers are feeling. And that in the end is what determines the outcomes, the effect on their psychological health and well-being, and whether they might submit for a WorkCover claim and so on. Switching to the second area, insufficient supervision. There were two aspects within this area. The first was inadequate training. So that's not preparing someone for the work that they have to do. It makes them feel overwhelmed and in the deep end, and they feel like that's a form of mistreatment, which they label bullying. Likewise, role ambiguity, as was identified in the previous review of existing research studies. So not having a clear scope for the job that a worker needs to undertake. So in order to reduce bullying, before it occurs, we can change the way that supervision is done in these areas through a risk management process. So a risk management process can tackle all of these issues in the organisation, because these are the leading indicators of bullying at work. These are the conditions and the context in daily operations in organisations that if we can change these and do them well, we can reduce the level of bullying or the perception of bullying in organisations. Switching now to my last point around organisational climate. Firstly, organisational climate shapes whether or not bullying might even occur in the first place. In my research, I've focused on this idea of psychosocial safety climate. What that really means is, how much does the organisation care about my mental health and well-being? Not just my physical health and well-being, with PPE and other standard operating procedures and things like that, that's really important, but what about mental health and well-being? Not just about production goals and making money and so on. Where does mental health and well-being fit in the priority? What this figure shows is that over time, as psychosocial safety climate increases from low to high, we can see that bullying also decreases over time. When bullying is low to begin with, it stays low, regardless of the climate. But in the right climate, we can see a reduction in bullying over time. Why is it important? Why might this idea of valuing mental health and well-being be important? Understanding this comes from one of our most recent research studies, which showed that when the workers felt that their mental health and well-being was valued at work, they were able to use their voice very early in bullying situations, and the situations were able to be resolved very quickly. On the other hand, when PSC was low, when psychosocial safety climate was low, workers didn't feel that their mental health and safety was really being cared for and taken seriously. What they do instead is that they start to neglect their work, they avoid the situation. Sometimes they go along with the status quo, so they go along with the bully's demands, but eventually they just can't withstand the bullying anymore. And so at that point they might try and say something and complaint, but the situation has already escalated far too much to be able to be resolved really well. And a common scenario is that that worker who's being targeted by the bully leaves the organisation. What makes the difference here? In these stories, in these rich interviews that we heard, it was all about having a good manager. So the importance of supervisors is highlighted again in a different way here. So in those situations where workers felt their mental health and well-being was being supported in the organisation, they felt they could talk to their manager. They could go straight to their manager with their concern, and they expected that their manager would do something meaningful to stop the bullying. And then, in turn, the managers personally took responsibility for changing the situation. They personally took it on board to make sure that the bullying didn't keep going before it escalates. Because after it escalates, it's very difficult to actually get a satisfactory outcome. Okay, so that was the evidence on the causes of bullying. Now I'm switching to evidence around prevention and intervention strategies. What's the scientific evidence for these? Again, I've got two key messages that I'd like you to take away. The first message is, even though I've spent a little bit of time convincing you that bullying is not a problem of interpersonal relationships, this is still the way it's tackled, both in practice and in terms of the published literature that evaluates prevention strategies. Still treating bullying as a problem of interpersonal relationships. So we really need to develop and evaluate more organisational level prevention strategies, and strategies that have really clear and concrete implementation plans so that organisations or people such as yourselves can actually implement these into daily operations. So here's a list of different strategies that an organisation might have in place to tackle workplace bullying. So the employer actions are in grey and the worker actions are in orange. So it's very common now to have a bullying policy and or a code of conduct. We see that in many Australian workplaces. There might be contact officers to see who might be mentioned in the policy. Certainly complaints are investigated and sometimes corrective action is taken, as well as support to the targets. So there might also be an education sort of program at the university, for example. We do our online bullying and harassment training. So the workers need to undertake that training and they just need to behave nicely to each other. And if bullying does occur, then they need to report it. Less common, I suggest, is actually monitoring the effect of these corrective measures and preparing staff to manage the bullying complaints. So these are the sort of the landscape. They kind of look familiar to you all, these sort of actions. When we plot them as to where they lie, though, you can see that most of them have an individual focus, and most of them are on correction and prevention, especially when we think about the ones that are actually most common. They all sit towards the individual, and they all sit towards, reacting to situations that are occurring rather than reducing those risk factors for bullying in the first place. What we really need to do, and something that's not done so often, is identify and reduce the risk conditions for bullying before it occurs. And so that's those causes of bullying I've been talking about, and those functional risk areas. We need to start looking at those and tackling those right from the start. Maybe one of the problems is that there's just not a lot of good evidence on what these organisational level solutions should be for bullying. So last year, a review of all possible published studies on bullying and incivility interventions was published, and only 12 studies actually met the inclusion criteria, and only 3 of those were rated as really being any good in a scientific way to actually be informative. So that's really saying 3 studies out of 25 years of research are going to be able to inform us. They're of sufficient quality to inform us about what to do about bullying. 2 of those were effective, and they were actually organisational focused interventions about civility, not bullying. And civility is a less severe pattern, more like ignoring someone in the lunchroom or things like that sort of level of behaviour. Nonetheless, this is what that effective intervention was. It's called Civility, Respect and Engagement in the Workplace, or CREW. It involves holding a meeting every week for 6 months, which is facilitated, using a toolkit which involves structured discussions and other exercises. It goes for about an hour. Now, it actually embodies some of the principles of psychosocial safety climate to give it that organisational focus. So the senior management in the organisation have to show commitment to this process. They've got to put some resources towards it. They publish a memo or a letter. They stand up and speak towards how important this is, and they sign a statement around that. And importantly, the workers are actively involved in the process. So the weekly meetings are run on the agenda based on what the workers bring to it, based on their experiences of incivility in the past week or two. And the exercises actually explore the organisational context for civility. So they're not so much about finding who did what and when to how. They go back and they track back to, oh yeah, this was a situation where we had a lot of patients, and so there was a lot of pressure in the system, and this is what happened and that. And so they track back to what those organisational causes of the uncivil behaviour might be. Which is probably why I think these 3 factors are why I think it actually works and works well. However, this is extremely intensive. I'm not sure really, but I wonder whether most organisations like Holden or whoever could actually commit to all of their workers to have 1 hour off to discuss all of these issues every week amongst the whole plethora of things that organisations are grappling with. So it's very, very intensive. Plus you need to have a trained facilitator to be able to do this. The decreases in incivility may not actually be sustained over time. So once you stop doing these meetings, a year later, the incivility kind of creeps up again. And the focus is on incivility, which is actually less intense and less severe than some of the behaviours we see in bullying. It can be one-off instances. It can be sort of what regarded as more milder forms of social behaviour. So it's unclear whether this actually even relates to be successful for workplace bullying as we understand it in the Australian context. So, what should we do then? Oh, last slide actually. If we do have a bullying complaint, and often when I talk to organisations, they really want to know how do I handle what's going on first and then tell me about what to do about preventing more cases. When we were going through those 342 complaints lodged with SafeWork SA in our big analysis, we were able to learn a few things. The first point is that informal early resolution is vital. So many of those cases wouldn't have ended up with SafeWork SA if the manager had been able to listen and respond to the situation, or if the manager was cited as a bully, if HR or someone else were able to make a really good set of steps to resolve the situation early. So that early resolution informally, before it becomes a formal complaint, is really vital. This means that formal complaints to be avoided, but it really relies on the skills of the supervisor or the skills of the contact officer in being able to do something, and their authority or power to be able to do something in that situation. If that's not possible, then of course the formal system needs to be utilised, but it needs to be utilised in a way that takes the complaint seriously. So you really need to listen and acknowledge and understand what's going on. It has to be carried out in a timely way. So often the stories that we heard, and I've heard this out, in my own practice as well, is that it just takes far, far too long for something to happen. And the other big downfall is that feedback's not provided. So the person who's made the complaint doesn't ever really get any outcome from that. They don't know if something happened, if something didn't happen. They hardly know whether it even was taken seriously or investigated. So there has to be consideration to a way of providing feedback to everyone involved without, of course, violating confidentiality. So return to work, previously WorkCoverSA claims can be avoided with a fair and timely process. So the way the formal process is discharged, if it's fair, if it's timely, if it meets the sort of justice needs of the person lodging the complaint, they're the most important predictors of whether or not they're going to make a return to work SA injury claim. Lastly, you might consider using an independent party to handle the complaint, particularly if the supervisor is the alleged bully, because of that power imbalance there that supervisors hold over their subordinate workers. So trying to bring this all together now, where should we direct our efforts if we're serious about preventing bullying at work? The first is to actually improve or optimise the way supervisors go about their daily supervision, and also worker behaviour as well, in these key risk areas, the key areas that are underlying risk conditions for bullying. So the management of underperformance, the way roles and tasks are set and clarified, issues connected to pay, rostering, leave, other sorts of entitlements, and training and development of workers, so preparing them for the work that they need to do. These are the key areas that workers perceive they're being mistreated, which is then related to their perception of bullying and lodging a complaint or a claim and so on. So if we can improve the way things go in these areas, that would go a long way towards preventing bullying complaints. And that's actually my next set of steps, is to work out what good performance of supervisors looks like in all of these areas, and to construct a risk auditing tool that can order those bullying risks and that can help change those behaviours well before bullying occurs. Organisations should also monitor a range of indicators. So if there's an annual climate survey, bullying should be in there. Other indicators of psychological health and well-being, of sickness, absence, of turnover, grievances, these are all indicators that something's not quite going right, and they should be monitored as well. And these risk contexts should be monitored if you're doing an annual survey collection. Maybe not in the behavioural sense that I'm talking about here, but maybe there's other indicators that things aren't going so well in these areas and they need some attention to reduce bullying at work. Then early intervention, which I've talked about, is really vital. So workers need to feel safe to be able to raise their concerns, and they need to feel like something will actually be done. A lot of complaints aren't reported early because of fear of retribution, that that bullying will actually get worse. So you've got to cultivate an environment where workers believe they have a voice and that something will happen when they raise the situation early. The ambulance service in New South Wales is actually doing some assertiveness training with all of its members to have these conversations early, and they're reporting a lot of success around this assertiveness training to enable people to voice things in the right way to get things resolved so that they don't escalate. Respond to bullying complaints, of course, when they, if it gets to that point, and that's really listening and understanding and acknowledging what's going on. And that sometimes is the main thing that targets want psychologically, is a real acknowledgement that someone has really heard and understood their situation and is taking it seriously. And then, of course, conducting the process in a timely, fair way that meets the needs of procedural justice, including the provision of feedback, so that we kind of close off that kind of process is really important. And then all of these things that are done to tackle bullying should be evaluated at some point, formally or informally. Then we can feed back into the system, see what's working, see what's not working so well, and improve things as we go. And that will actually change the organisational climate from the bottom up. So they're the main points I wanted to make for you today, and I'm very happy to hang around now for questions.